Hey everyone, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's my great pleasure on behalf of COI2, the Centre for Informed Futures, to welcome Dr Salvatore Aricò, who's the Chief Executive of the International Science Council, who will be joining us for this webinar alongside Sir Peter Gluckman, who, as many of you already know, is the President of the International Science Council. With that, in terms of housekeeping for the next hour, Sir Peter and Salvatore are going to go through and give you a bit of an overview of the current state of the global science and science diplomacy challenges that they're facing on a day-to-day basis on an International Science Council perspective. We're going to have plenty of time for questions, so please feel free to put your questions through the chat or the Q&A, and we'll work our way through it in about 30 minutes or so. So thank you very much for joining us, and with that, I will hand over to Sir Peter to start the discussion.
Thanks, Emma. Well, look, we all know that science and international science cooperation are facing some real challenges. The difficulty is to know and understand what those challenges really are in a way, and how we, as the International Science Council, need to address them. Now, for those who are not so certain, the International Science Council is the principal non-governmental organisation that represents the active scientific community in the global system. It's comprised of national academies, international scientific unions, both from the natural and social sciences, a variety of other scientific organisations. The New Zealand member, for instance, is the Royal Science Society Te Aparangi, and it's based in Paris. And it has a very long history under different names. Some of you may have known it as the International Council of Scientific Unions and the International Social Science Council, which combined to form the ISC in 2018. We'll talk more about it later in relationship to the challenges, but I think we need to think about it from the point of view of the organisation which is charged with the responsibility of thinking about how we respond to a set of challenges. What are we really trying to protect, and what are we trying to advance here? It's not our role to advance the interests of a particular scientific enterprise in a particular place, but it is our role to protect science as a knowledge system, which after all is the only universal knowledge system we have. And secondly, to protect international science, because international science is needed to deal with so many of the global, so-called challenges to the global commons. I think it's important to remember that what we are focusing on, therefore, are the principles, protecting the principles of science, because the nature of how science is used and the way science is organised in different jurisdictions will vary by context and history. But fundamentally, one of the biggest issues we now face is a loss of perceptions of trust in science. Now, I'm very careful to say the word perceptions of trust in science, because in fact, when one talks to the disinformation scholars, it turns out that in fact, it's the use of science that is distrusted more often than the actual science itself. But I think that the issues of loss of trust in science are not just a matter of the last few years. They actually go back to the 1980s and the postmodernist discussions of that time, which actually shifted, perhaps rightly, from the Miltonian position of science as standing on a pedestal, just preaching truth at an ignorant population, to a much more relativistic position, relationship to other knowledge systems and so forth. But that, and the better social science, STS scholars would agree that that went too far, but triggered alongside a lot of other things that were happening in society, a progressive loss of trust in science, or trustworthy perceptions of science as the trustworthy knowledge system. Alongside that, and it's a matter that we've been reflecting a lot on, are the issues of the social contract between science and society. That social contract is always going to be tender and always needs to be nourished. And I think at times the hubris of scientists has undermined that social contract. And that was aggravated particularly in some of the actions that happened during COVID. And secondly, I think science has too often seen itself as isolated and entitled, and feeling that the government, the societies need to give science the money to do what it does and leave it alone. And I think you can see that in some of the arguments that surrounded the unfortunate changes in the Marsden Fund last year, when the real issue was not about that, but being sure that the public understood the value of social science and humanities and the issues that arise in that discussion. Won't go into that now. Alongside that issue, and they're not identical, is the rise of populism in the democratic world over the last 15 to 20 to 25 years. It probably dates back to when the economic issues of the 1980s first emerged, and as inequalities have driven and the neoliberal model has not delivered what it promised, it's led to increasing frustrations within elements of society. COVID clearly exacerbated that in other ways, particularly in debates over the role of the so-called deep state. And scientists got confused in that, because fundamental to what populism is a distrust in the idea of a deep state, people who make decisions in ways that are abstract to those who actually are affected by the decisions. And secondly, the belief that there is no definitive knowledge system except of that of the people themselves. On top of that, with the emergence of social media, polarization has meant that people are and it's not the same thing as populism, has moved people to extremes in the political positions, and of course plays off the cognitive biases people have against their priors, the so-called inconvenient truths that come up and from science and confuse and confront people's own biases. A separate issue, and one that is not unique to the United States, but has been particularly confronting in recent months, has been, what are universities for? And the debate about whether universities are issues of social change or universities are institutions of knowledge and teaching has become particularly acute in a number of jurisdictions and has become confused with the science issue. And I think it's quite helpful when one looks at what's going on in the US now to separate, although they are not different in their effect on the science system, there are two different things going on here. There's an attack on science and there's an attack on universities. They're quite different. And against all of that, which is a change, there is emerging fundamental new equilibrium. We only have to go back 10 years to 2015 when the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, were launched, the Paris Accords were reached, the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, all of which had very strong scientific underpinnings, were all agreed. Within a decade, you can see the very changing global attitude out there. And we have an emerging new equilibrium, in part driven because science, technology, economic power, and geostrategic power have all become, they've always been linked, but they're more tightly linked than they ever were before. And that is causing considerable issues in how science projects itself, as we're hearing mantras more and more, as open as possible, but as closed as necessary in every national science discussion. The geostrategic position has changed, but it's been emerging for some time. Scholars of geopolitical change would argue that the emergence of the distinct geotechnopoles, the growing isolation of America from the rest of the Western Alliance has been growing for some time. And when we see that all happening in context, we need to recognize that the withdrawal is not just strictly American in origin. For example, one of the most major funders of international science, perhaps not, was SIDA, the Swedish aid agency. It stopped funding science, international science, 2 or 3 years ago with a political change. You've seen in Hungary the big shift leading to the closure of the Central European University. You've seen across the so-called democratic world a rise of focus in science on innovation at the expense of science. You've seen now 2 things happen which are having a further effect. One is, around the world, a growing investment in defence-related issues. And where does that increased expenditure come from? Science is one of the areas that is at risk in a number of countries, as countries are massively increasing their defence expenditure. Secondly, we're seeing suddenly this acute shock of America withdrawing significantly from the global commons in ways that perhaps were not predictable. Sorry, I'm just being bugged by somebody. But the real issue has been the US has been the disproportionate funder of international science for the last 40 years. It's not just through NSF and NASA, Department of Energy, or Department of Defense in the case of DARPA, but through USAID, which has been the biggest, perhaps arguably the biggest funder of developing world research in the developing world for a long, long time. I was talking to my friend who is head of CAPRISA, the major South African research centre for virus research, HIV, AIDS, as well as COVID. CAPRISA, they've lost 50% of their funding in the last few weeks. This is the scale of change that's happening out there. And just screaming and yelling about it is not going to change things, because we are facing a new equilibrium. So the challenge for the International Science Council is how to reach out and rebuild the social contract with science and society on one hand, and on the other hand, how to link that to the decision makers in society. And those of you who saw me at the Select Committee on Science at Parliament yesterday, and it will be put up on our website in the next few days, will see the arguments I was trying to make. But secondly, the ISC has the role of trying to protect and promote international science cooperation, and Sal will talk about that in a moment. This is nothing that the ISC has not been preparing for some time. We've been, over the last 2 to 3 years, revising our strategic focus, revising our strategic framework to focus on the relationship with the multilateral system, to focus on our role in so-called track 2 or informal science diplomacy. But let's not kid ourselves. We are in a very difficult situation where just screaming and yelling will invite further challenges to the science system, whereas what we've got to do is find constructive ways to remind societies, remind governments that science is critical, and it's in the national interest of countries to promote science that addresses the issues of the global commons, climate change, biodiversity, food and water security, and so forth, or else every nation will suffer. And it's how we change in a less globalized world the conversation that it's in the national interest of every country to support activities on the global commons is part of the challenge that we at the ISC is facing. So with that, I think I'll pass over to Salvatore.
Thank you, Sir Peter and Hema, and good afternoon, everyone. My role at the International Science Council is to operationalize the strategic directions of the governing board, of which Sir Peter is the president. And I'd like to start by saying that this International Science Council, which used to federate the academies of sciences of the world, and still does, together with so it's the academies of both natural and social sciences of more than 140 countries, plus some 40 plus international disciplinary unions that cover, let's say, conventional disciplines such as the International Union of Mathematics, but also on the social sciences side, the International Union of Sociology, the history of sciences, etc. There also are some 20 plus academies of young scientists that are members to the ISC. And we also have a number of funding organizations. So it's an interesting ecosystem because it's not just academies, it's an ecosystem of a science ecosystem representing the main stakeholder groups that operate in such a landscape ecosystem. But this organization has been rather self-referential in the past couple of years and resistant to change, to the realization that science in society, the role of science in society has changed. And that while scientists and science organizations could afford limiting their efforts to the coordination of the science agenda, there is now a need to get out of that comfort zone and reach out. So in the current context that Peter just described, what are the kind of actions that the International Science Council has undertaken or plans to undertake in the near future? The first has been to set up an observatory to assess impacts on science systems, impacts on scientific cooperation. That is to say, in a way, how the conditions under which science systems operate are evolving. So it's not only about assessing the impacts of certain decisions in the US, or Peter also mentioned the examples of Sweden and so on and so forth, with the idea of coming back to, how do we come back to a situation whereby that would allow us to retrieve the 40% for science funding, for research funding that we have, or for science funding more generally speaking, that we have benefited from that given country. It's a set of more fundamental questions. So that is, where is science going? Who are the new players, the new champions of science? It's about reorganizing the alliances of science champions to pursue some of the important science and society battles, for example, in relation to sustainability. When the Sustainable Development Goals were the so-called 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was conceived 15 years ago, actually 10 years ago, with 5 years to go before we take stock of the agenda and see where we stand with it. We still used to talk about sustainable development in a rather paternalistic way, as if the whole challenge was essentially a global South challenge. Nowadays, sustainability issues are everywhere, not just in terms of environmental sustainability, but also in terms of social sustainability. There are major issues related to inequality, but also social organization, that is to say, social fragmentation, lack of social cohesion, poverty, in very rich countries and in very rich cities. Take California, the fourth global economy nowadays is faced with major social issues. So the first lesson in this reorganization of how science efforts unfold is, to me, an important sort of shift in the discourse from sustainable development towards sustainability. But the International Science Council is also trying to implement some, in addition to assessing the situation through the observatory effort, which I just mentioned. Also, how do we support scientists in terms of provision of guidance on how scientists can operate in times of conflicts, in times of crisis, in times of mistrust in institutions, of which science is unfortunately perceived as being one, an institution, an elite. And again, Peter has referred to it, and there are ways of rethinking the contract between science and society, so that the perception is that of science as an effort, as a collective effort, as an enterprise, which is there to engage with society, to co-design the research agenda, to co-deliver solutions. Among the concrete actions carried out by the International Science Council, there also are some technical, if you like, initiatives. So, for example, the mirroring of data repositories, the repositories of scientific data, which is an exercise in which the Council engaged in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine through one of its affiliated bodies, the World Data System, and the lessons learned there are being utilized to mirror data sets, data repositories which might be in danger. But overall, I think demonstrating the societal relevance of science is possibly the biggest challenge faced by science systems, by scientists, and therefore by the International Science Council at this stage. At the same time, we also need to recognize that we need to protect the science, and we need to protect science, that science can continue dealing with the issues of global relevance, such as the future of the climate system, of our shared climate system, the global commons, and but it's not just challenges that science is and scientists, science systems and scientists are facing. There are also opportunities. Perhaps starting with the region, let me mention Antarctica. Let me mention the fact that New Zealand is soon, in my analysis, to emerge as a leader with regard to the science of poles, with a specific reference to the Antarctica, in the context of a major science effort, which is being co-convened by the International Science Council, together with the Scientific Commission Committee for Antarctica Research, SCAR, in the context of as a contribution to a United Nations decade for the cryosphere. And there we have the opportunity, and we, the international community and New Zealand within the region and globally, to play a key role with regard to to those issues of common of global relevance. And coming back to my original point, it's interesting to see new alliances and new players emerge. I'll give a couple of examples. So, the way the discourse vis-à-vis China has evolved in Europe, with now new alliances emerging between European countries and the European Commission as a whole, and China, which is an emerging important actor in the area of science and technology. And literally until a couple of months ago, not to say weeks only, the perception of that important player in the science and technology area, China, was completely different. It is evolving. And new actors as well. For example, I mentioned Antarctica, but let me now talk about the Arctic. In the Arctic, there are non-Arctic, an increasing number of non-Arctic players expressing an interest for the International Polar Year, for the UN Decade, for the Cryosphere, including, believe it or not, the United Arab Emirates. And therefore, science continues to unfold as a universal endeavor, an endeavor of universal interest potentially. And because of that, it has to be guided, those science efforts, by principles of the international scientific collaboration and also the values that must underpin peaceful dialogues among countries, including through science. And this is what the International Science Council is trying to facilitate at such difficult times, not just for science, but for many countries and many aspects of society. And yet, we think there is no way to, we can't afford being nostalgic or, simply pronouncing statements from an advocacy perspective with the idea that science systems will be able to benefit from the conditions that they have benefited from in the past 30, 40 years. Things are changing. We need to adapt. We need to lead. And we stand, optimistic in the sense that there will be new equilibria, as Peter said, that will unfold.
Thank you, Salvatore and Peter. We are open for questions, so please feel free to pop through your questions or raise your hands. I might get started with one. And over the course of the week, and even in the introductory comments just now, we've talked a lot about science, the role of science and science communications. And do you have a perspective on how the science communication needs to evolve and the different modalities of it to address some of the challenges we're facing here and going forward?
Well, I think there's been a lot of commentary written in the last few weeks, some of it by myself, but others written by a lot more informed people than me, on the need to think again about science communication, which, whatever we think about how we do it, it still comes across as somewhat arrogant and somewhat dogmatic and patronizing, I guess. And it may be that scientists are no longer going to be the key players in science communication. It may well be that we need to think a lot more about it. The ISC has got 2 projects either underway or in reflection that are relevant, or 3, actually. One is, we had a workshop jointly with the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission last September, and the report is published, on the whole issue of trust in science, and to what extent is the issue of trust in science just an overflow or a consequence of a general decline in trust in institutions. Certainly, trust in individual scientists remains high when one looks at the classic surveys. But the issue, to what extent is trust in the institutions of science a factor which is just simply a function of the loss of trust overall in institutions, was the subject of that debate. And I think it's still an open question, but I think there's a clear bias towards a general collapse, that we're suffering the institutions of science in the same way that other institutions are suffering, even though in relative terms we tend to be somewhat higher as a trusted set of institutions. The second thing that we are working on is the issue of how to deal with the challenge of populism. And there it's not a very simple matter. It's not a simple matter, but it's a matter of actually understanding what kind of communication strategies might work with people of a populist bias who are influenced by populists. And there we're working with and proposing a small think tank of people who have a particular expertise in that area. More completely, and I think New Zealand can be somewhat proud of what it's done, is the ISC has been right at the forefront of promoting transdisciplinarity and true transdisciplinarity of a way of engaging non-scientists in the business of science. And that is not easy. I think some of the national science challenges approached the ways it might be done, and I encourage people to read some of the ISC reports. The website's council.science, about how transdisciplinary research might become the needed new modality at far greater scale than it is now, which means that the stakeholders, the end users, be the policymakers, business, community, iwi, whānau, are directly involved not just in the conduct of the science, but actually in designing the scientific questions in the first place. It's a very different way, and of course the funding of that and the assessment of that kind of science is very different to mode 1 science use, the traditional nomenclature of how you would categorize science. And again, the ISC has been at the forefront of the discussions and promoting that through the Global Research Council and others. The Global Research Council is again the relatively informal international grouping of national level science funders, like the MB here and so forth, and equivalents overseas. So I think the issue of communication and science also depends on who the target is. The way I was talking about the role of science to parliamentarians yesterday will be different to the way I talk about it to other groups in society. And I think that we can't pretend that scientists are necessarily their own best communicators, nor should we pretend that the institutions of science are necessarily the best communicators when they usually have an agenda which is self-evident of promotion for more funding. So I think there's some real challenges here, which I think we're still reflecting on and trying to work through.
If I may follow on that, and at the risk of sounding a bit overly simplistic, the main challenge that scientists have faced so far when it comes to science, communicating science, has been about how one would communicate uncertainty, qualify uncertainty, reduce uncertainty through better scientific method, and ultimately communicate that uncertainty so that policymakers could deal with it in a way which would be meaningful and practical. And those, that challenge is still there, and while the scientists may actually consider uncertainty as their best friend because it obliges them to reopen the way they frame problems conceptually and methodologically, we are still facing some difficulties in terms of how we deal with uncertainty in the context of policy making. But I think nowadays the main challenge, when it comes to science communications, is really the very value proposition of science, in the sense that science has to demonstrate its societal value, and we should not confuse that with the issue of science having to operate in a way which is free and independent, which is a condition sine qua non of science, will not be in a position to essentially produce knowledge in a free and independent way. That has to continue. But science also has to demonstrate its value proposition when it comes to vis-a-vis society, and there are ways of doing that. And within the International Science Council, we are trying to deliver that value proposition in a systematic way. For example, through the practice of science advice. There is one affiliated body of the ISC, which is called the International Network of Government Science Advice, that was in fact established by Sir Peter several years ago. And by now, the practice of science advice has been refined enough so that scientists can be trained in the practice of science advice. Another important contribution is brokerage at the science policy interface, especially at the UN level, at the level of the United Nations. How do you not just convey in a rather mechanistic way what we know about a given issue, be that sea level rise or plastics in the world ocean, but how do you actually engage in a dialogue between scientists and policymakers in a way that the evidence, the knowledge we have becomes evidence which can be used in the policymaking context. I also wanted to reiterate what Peter said about the importance of transdisciplinary science and the role of transdisciplinary science in the co-production of knowledge on the basis of questions which are co-designed by scientists and with the stakeholders other than the active scientific community. Even within the scientific community, there has been a huge debate about the notion of co-design. Many scientists were resisting the idea that research questions would be designed by individuals and organizations other than scientists and science organizations. But there was another school of thought which I'm glad is actually imposing itself, which is to say, if you don't design research questions together with the users, generally speaking, you are going to miss the point, because the knowledge that is going to be generated is likely not to be actionable enough. So things are evolving, but just to sort of underline that it's not just a matter of communications in the conventional sense of the term. It really is about the value proposition of the new value proposition of science in the current increasingly complex context.
We have quite a few questions around science communications, but I'm going to go to a different one. We've got one around that's asking, how does the view that we need science because it is our only universal knowledge system fit with the increasingly common political stance that shows no adherence to the truth? If truth matters less or not at all, what value does a universal knowledge system have?
Well, that's the challenge of the moment. I mean, and we must acknowledge that that's as I said in my earlier remarks, that's the challenge which we're addressing. I mean, the reality is that there are both populists that reject other sources of truth, and there are people who don't like to hear the inconvenient truths that science brings and confronts their cognitive biases. And so that is about selling the value of the principles of science need to be explained. What science is not. I mean, science has gone through periods where there have been high prominent scientists who claim that they know the answers to everything. Science has its limits, and we must acknowledge those limits. And those limits are often reflected in how societies make their decisions. And I think until science doesn't exhibit as much hubris as it has exhibited in the past, it will always create an abreaction. But I think that in reality, and all the work that's come out from scholars of disinformation, it shows that people reject science that doesn't fit their biases. There are relatively few people really reject science as a whole. They may say they do as a badge of political affiliation, but in practice they don't. Otherwise, they'll never get on an aeroplane, for example. You know, I'm being a bit facetious, but seriously, the hardcore cognitive psychologists who studied the people who say they reject science shows that, in fact, the bulk of them, 95% of them, accept science. It's just they don't like its use, and then they put into a badge of honor that they don't believe in science. So I think we've got to be careful what we think is going on out there. I think the issue that the second part of your question refers to is, how does science relate to decision making? And that's where what Sal termed brokerage of knowledge is important. And that needs to be done in ways that needs to sometimes, most of the time, dislocate itself from the self-interest of the scientist who may go in there saying more research is needed. In other words, give me more money. Decision makers generally need to make a decision on what's known at that time. And therefore, the way science is communicated at that time, and the way science is made pluralistic in that context, because it's not just one science. There are multiple sciences, the natural and social sciences, involved in virtually every decision. And at the end of the day, whatever the science says or cannot say, there are other factors that come into every decision. And Harry Collins and Robert Evans, who are two of the best scholars of science, STS scholars, wrote a book saying why democracies need science. And it's a book that I think everybody would read. They would say that science is needed to provide the knowledge on which other people, i.e. the democratic processes, can make decisions. And what I think in the science system reports, we're making a lot about the need to protect and develop the science advisory mechanisms. I'm pleased to see that finally we have a new chief science advisor being appointed. We also have now got a Prime Minister's Science, Technology, Innovation Advisory Council, which means that we can look across the whole of government, because so much of what's done in New Zealand using science by governments is actually not through MB in the science system, but through the many other agencies that invest a lot of money in R&D. Now, whether it's good R&D or bad R&D depends on the situation and the processes used. But we should not shy away from the fact that governments actually use science all the time. Where they use it well is the issue that we continue to focus on. And the argument there is not that science gives you better answers, but science gives you the information so governments can make better decisions, taking into account all the other issues they need to consider. And Sal raised the other point. We must always acknowledge that there are gaps in the knowledge base, there are uncertainties, and despite we always say that the policymakers don't like uncertainties, in fact, policymakers live all the time with uncertainties. It's how we communicate our uncertainties in ways that are useful to them.
If I may very quickly pick on the word truth, which was used in the question. And I think that science does not bring truth. It's not there to bring truth. It is there to elucidate. For example, in relation to issues related to emerging technologies, let's take AI. For example, how can a proper fully AI-ready data assist AI tools deliver, quality-assured products versus the current discourse on AI validation, which appears to be, I'm no expert in this area, but by discussing with experts like Hema herself, it appears to be a very difficult endeavor, even technically speaking. So it's science more generally, perhaps at a philosophical level. Science is not there to validate. For example, there should not be any validation of indigenous knowledge by science. Science is there to contribute to generating evidence on the basis of the very the principles that are there to guide science, experimentation, analysis, review. But once that piece of knowledge is there, that piece has to, if you like, come to terms with other pieces of the puzzle. So I think staying humble, staying pragmatic with our feet on the ground is the best way to continue to demonstrate the value of science.
Thank you. We've got another question here, and I think going back to a point you made earlier, Sal, around some of the new players and the new ways and the new coalitions in the science community is being established globally. So with that, there's a question here around how do we identify who are the new champions of science in this changing environment? And once we identify them, how do we ensure we create the right environments and enable those people to have a voice in this and shape the direction that science takes going forward?
Well, perhaps I can get started, because I think this is really a question that can benefit from Peter's experience in the practice of not just science advice, but in how science, if you like, is utilized as a tool for economic development, but also for diplomacy. I can just say that within the constituency of the ISC, which is a rather large constituency, we are, as Sir Peter said, a non-governmental organization, and yet, if you take, one of our members from China, the Chinese Association for Science and Technology, that particular entity is a de facto reflection, or brings to the table the way China, which is a very big player globally, is dealing with the science and technology. And in that context, without wanting to unfold anything, I wouldn't say, there is nothing secret but delicate vis-a-vis our Chinese colleagues. But I think it's a good example. They have shared with us the fact that they feel a bit shy in stepping up and increasing their support to the International Science Council, international efforts in the area of science. So in a context like that, the International Science Council, comes to the picture as a broker, as an organization that provides a safe platform for science, champions, potential and actual, to occupy, more space and perhaps compensate for the fact that other of among the conventional actors, for multiple reasons, are now, going to play a less important a role. So, and that applies also to providing a platform for countries that don't traditionally collaborate with each other to actually come to the ISC and talk with each other. So it's a different aspect. It's not directly related to the question, but I just wanted to plant that seed also on the importance of dialogues between science actors from countries that may actually on paper face some tensions, but in that context the ISC plays a big role in building bridges among countries through science.
I think in more direct relationship to the answer, the problem, not the problem, the opportunity lies in the fact that the concept of in a multipolar world, there are multiple alliances for different purposes all the time. So the alliance that might exist for trade and it may be very different to the alliance that might exist for security purposes, might exist for other purposes. And we've seen alliances that exist, for instance, in relationship to the Nile Valley, of countries that don't get on and other things working together because of the water rights, for example. So there are many different ways in which alliances are going to exist. But I think the underlying challenge in all of this is the issue that science, technology, economic, and geostrategic / defense / security interests, they've always been intertwined, but they're more intertwined than ever before as technology is increasingly, science-based technology, both in the life sciences and in the digital sciences, are going to drive economic growth and other forms of development into the future more than ever before. The world in 10 years' time is going to be so much driven by the technological advances. And for a country like New Zealand, we will never have technological sovereignty. We're 5 million people, a very small component of the world's scientific system. We cannot do everything, and we certainly cannot do everything on our own. And therefore, alliances can be both top-driven by countries, diplomat to diplomat, but they actually depend on individual-to-individual relationships. And certainly, I believe New Zealand needs to reinvest and rethink how science positions itself internationally in that space. And certainly, I'm not been afraid to say that in the certain corridors in Wellington of a beehive-shaped building. And then, but we do have this complication of as open as possible, as closed as necessary, which is the mantra which politicians and policymakers are using in every country, both in the developed and in the developing world, about science. Closed as possible referred originally to the dual use issues of security-related science, semiconductors for missile development or whatever. But that definition is becoming broader and broader and broader because of the issue of economic diplomacy, economic interests, economic poles appearing in the world, in a more fractured world. And therefore, the dangers and what's going on in science beyond the realities that the world is living in a different way post-COVID in terms of actually moving people around the world is caught up. So we've seen countries now excluding fellows or researchers from a particular country being in areas beyond the dual use areas into areas which may have economic advantage. Now, that's, I think, a very difficult issue. I've sat in international ministerial meetings in science and technology in the last year with 60 to 70 countries, and everyone gets up and uses as open as possible, as closed as necessary, with the code word meaning we're going to expose our closed as necessary definitions. And the issue for New Zealand as a small country is it has to work hard to overcome that. And we have a country which has not invested in recent years much in international science cooperation and much in international scientific interchange. And that needs to change. Otherwise, we will be left behind in this increasingly technological era. And that is something that you might expect I might be making some comments on.
Thank you. In the last few minutes, we have one question, which I think is worth unpacking if we have a few minutes to do it in, is earlier you made the point about we need to be better at communicating uncertainty. And how exactly do you go about doing that?
Oh, I think that's easy. I think you start from the point, decision maker, we don't know everything, but we understand you need to make a decision now on the basis of what we do know, and then be honest about what we do know, what we don't know, the caveats on what we know, the caveats on what no, and say from what we know now, these are the options you have. Each of those options has different implications, but you need to take those, and then now you need to keep the non-scientific components into account. I don't think that's challenging. It's challenging for the scientists to admit they don't, and it needs skilled people. I don't think brokerage and knowledge is easy. It needs people who are skilled in it to do it. But I think you're trusted. Immediately you say you don't have all the answers, you're more trusted than we know, saying you know exactly what to do. I think that you've always got to allow space for the person on the other end to put their viewpoint on the table, and that needs to be a dynamic interchange in a way that isn't say we know better because of this. We need to take you through why we know something, what we know, how we know it, and that's possible. I think the other domain of it is what New Zealand is not good at, and I think one of the issues that underpins all this discussion is, for a variety of reasons, New Zealand has very short time. New Zealanders, at least our non-Indigenous New Zealanders, have very short time preferences. We tend to think about the here and now or the short term. We're not good at thinking about the long term. Yet science in general is thinking about the longer term. And within that, we do not use the disciplines of foresight in this country well. The fact that, and foresight is not about predicting the future. Foresight is about understanding the shocks and stresses, weak and strong, which may influence the direction of travel into the future, and what decisions you make now, which will constrain the range of future possibilities to ones that are more acceptable. Now, we don't do that well because we think in a short time base, and we don't recognise we can make decisions now in ways that will have influence and change the range of futures for the future in a more or less desirable way, depending on what we do. And I mean, now just giving a self-advertisement, that's what KOI2, our centre, is all about, is thinking about how we get New Zealanders to think on a longer-term time base than a shorter-term time base, and how to use the skills of foresight in doing so.
Well, on that, thank you very much, Sir Peter and Salvatore, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon as well. And the webinar will be available on our website. And certainly, if you want more details, we will also put up the details of the ISC, so you can follow up on some of the various documents and publications that the ISC have on this subject. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.